Hospital porters, pride and dignity, stop the New World Order. Welcome to HPANWO TV. Well, I am actually in Portsmouth today. I'm actually at a place called Hilsey in Portsmouth, and this is Copner Road, to be precise, 301 Copner Road, currently occupied by the 301 Jewellers. So they've put their address into the name of the shop. I'm here to talk about a very, very strange case indeed. One which I was advised not to pursue by somebody. Somebody told me, let it go, don't go there, Ben, let it go. It's a case that operates on many levels, and this person told me let it go because the things I'm going to talk about happened a long time in the past, but they're still controversial. There's still a lot of contemporary research going on into this case, and I think it's still extremely relevant to the world we live in today. Extremely relevant indeed. So I'm not going to let it go. Now, this little house here, and this little flat above it, and this little shop, actually are the location of one of the most unusual incidents I've ever come across. One which combines paranormal and government cover-ups in almost equal proportions. It's centered around a lady called Helen Duncan. Helen Duncan was a psychic medium who originally came from Perthshire in Scotland. She was born in 1897 and died in 1956. I'll be talking more about her death and the elements behind that later. I've done an article about this anyway, and I've done a special radio show, 2 radio shows about it actually, and I'll put links in the description box to those. But I do hope you'll bear with me, because in this film we're going to actually visit the locations I talk about. Hellish Nell, that was her nickname, Hellish Nell. And she didn't get that nickname from her paranormal talents. She got it because she had a bit of a fiery temper on her. She was a typical Scotswoman actually, a bit of a tomboy, hot-headed. And that's something she was like as a child, and she displayed it her entire life. From the cradle to the grave though, she had these very rare psychic abilities, the most unusual actually, remarkable psychic abilities of all, and that is she was a physical medium. She was for instance, and then the physical mediums are not just people who say, oh, is there anyone here called David? David, are you there? Not like that. Although I keep an open mind to those. These are mediums who can actually create physical changes in the world around them. Now, for instance, she was really lousy at school, never got an education, but she said that when she put her writing book under her chair, she'd pull it out later and somebody had written in the correct answers to her questions. She also used to worry her classmates an awful lot, and her teachers used to be very scared of her because she used to go into a trance and she used to yell portents of doom and start shouting and yelling. Now, a skeptic of course would say she was suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, because skeptics say that kind of things, you know what I mean. But a lot of people took her seriously, and she proved very useful. For instance, there was one occasion when a man got lost in a snowstorm, and this man got lost in a snowstorm, and Helen used her abilities to find him. What in the modern world is now called remote viewing. That term wasn't used back then, but she managed to locate this man lost in a snowstorm. And as she grew older, she learned to control these experiences, and she became a physical medium. She was from a very poor family. She was in poor health all her life. She couldn't work. Neither could her husband. Her husband was originally a cabinet maker. He used to just make cabinets for not the political type, the furniture in the house. But he became ill as well, and he couldn't work. So basically, she had to support them both, and she was very successful actually. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that actually. I'm not a socialist. Let people let people earn a living if they want. Let them make it even a very, very good living, and a very, very lucrative living. That's fine with me. It doesn't make their paranormal abilities unreal just because they're making money off them. That's another fallacy the skeptics always come up with. But she used to produce raps which allowed knocking noises like this. That's a rap. She used to just produce these out of thin air. And telekinesis as well, which is moving objects without touching them. And in 1929 she started producing ectoplasm, which is It's a white substance which is issued from the body of mediums, from their mouth, their nose, even from sometimes under their fingernails. And it forms, it's like a white milky substance, but it hangs in the air and it forms into shapes. And sometimes these shapes are recognisable as people. They form faces, they form bodies, even whole bodies of people, hands, things like that. And Helen used to do this. And by about 1930, she was actually quite famous, and her business was booming. And then psychical researchers got involved, because psychical research wasn't quite as taboo in those days as it is now. And it was a serious subject that many universities studied. The Society of Psychical Research was founded in the 19th century, and they tried to try and see if this was provable by experimentation through scientific expenses, but scientific endeavour. And so Helen was sent to London, all expenses paid trip to London, all the way from Edinburgh on the train. Must have been very, very nice for her, because she was asked to become a guinea pig in the laboratories of the London Spiritualist Alliance. But I think that this trip in the end proved very troublesome for Helen, and she regretted it. She was declared a fraud by the LSA, and that's the official story. She was denounced as nothing more than a fraud by everyone who investigated her. And this is, if you look it up today, any article about her, that's what you'll find. But I wonder if it's possible that all this discrediting in the media and in the psychical literature is somehow biased. Because according to them, she was just doing conjuring tricks, stuff like that, and I'll come into the details of that in a minute. But the thing about it is, when she agreed to do this research with the LSA, she signed an exclusivity contract, which she eventually broke. It's possible she was being a bit naive and she didn't realise, but there was a lot of rivalry in psychical research in those days. There's still a bit today, but apart from the KTPF show, Keep the Paranormal Friendly, that wasn't around in those days, yeah. But the LSA was in sort of locked in competition with Harry Price, who was this solo maverick. Now, what happened was that the SPR had tendered. They couldn't just go up and ask her. They had to go through a tendering process to bid for who would basically run Helen's experiment, and the LSA got it, and Harry Price was really pissed off about that. He got very, very angry about that. But so what he did was he actually approached Helen privately and secretly and asked her if she would drop into his laboratory as well. Now, when the LSA, and then also he asked her not to tell the LSA because she signed this exclusivity contract. Now, when the LSA heard about this, they hit the roof. And there must have been some very, very heated phone calls in Price's laboratory. I mean, they were, you know, from their point of view, they'd invited her to London. She was staying there on their tab, and there he was moonlighting. There she was, you know, swanning off and moonlighting with her arch enemy. Of course, this affected her relationship with Price, and it affected her relationship with the LSA. She had blazing rows with him and walked out. Now, the skeptics make a big deal out of this Barney she had with Price. She said it was because Price wanted to x-ray her, and she refused because she had this cheesecloth in her stomach. How absurd that is, I'll come back to that in a minute. But she knew that if she was examined by x-ray, Price would spot that she had this cheesecloth in her stomach. Now, it was a textbook. She was searched thoroughly. In those days, mediums did. It was quite normal for them to hide props, the fake ones, right? Not the real ones. The fake ones used to hide props in their nose, in their mouth, and in their kind of pelvic region. Yes, there. And so Helen agreed to be searched, and in fact, she did this when she was holding her séances. She would be searched by a nurse, and this would be observed by female members of the audience. So she put herself through this indignity in order to prove that she was for real. And so it's strange that she was suddenly objected to Price. I mean, Price wouldn't do it personally. He had an assistant called Molly Goldney, and she would be the one who'd be searching her, not Price himself. But Helen was furious. Now, she accused Price of lying to her. She accused Molly Goldney of lying. Even her own husband was accused of manipulating her behind her back. And what this was, right, this was all centred on a lady called Mary McGinley, who was actually an employee of Helen's, who actually worked as a maid and did several other jobs for Helen. And Helen accused her, what it was, McGinley supposedly had gone to Price and the LSA and told them that Helen was faking the ectoplasm by swallowing cheesecloth and regurgitating it. Cheesecloth is this very, very thin fabric you see wrapped around cheese, and hence its name. And she took great big sheets of this, swallow it, but then bring it up again. Now Price, this is actually the first time that cheesecloth has ever been named. This method was even named. Price didn't come up with this idea, it came from Mary McGinley. But Price claimed that after that, he wrote in his report that that's what she was doing, even though he only managed to obtain a very small sample of this alleged cheesecloth. What he said was it was a mixed cheesecloth mixed with egg white and tissue paper, and he managed to take a small sample of it, right? Now, what he doesn't explain is how Helen managed to swallow this, keep it in her stomach, make it invisible to X-rays, and then regurgitate it again without leaving vomit stains all over the place, and swallow it again, of course. Basically, it's really, it all went a bit funny because obviously Price poached her. The LSA were angry, Price was angry, and basically the experiment was never completed anyway. But Price did obtain some photographs. But I mean, it was all pretty ridiculous. I mean, his report is, even though he's done some good work, that guy, his report is ludicrous. You know, I mean, I've seen skeptics claim that they can reproduce all the effects that psychic mediums produce using non-psychic means, and I've seen skeptics do that. I've seen skeptics bend spoons. I've seen skeptics use cold reading and reproduce some of the effects of a medium. I've seen skeptics perform bare-handed surgery, but I've never ever seen James Randi or any other skeptic swallow a 6-foot square piece of fabric without using their hands, without making any mess, regurgitate it, and then swallow it again while tied to a chair. I've never seen any of them do that. But this study was basically used. This research which Price did, unfortunately, came back to haunt Helen many years later. It was used to blacken her name, and I'll be explaining exactly what happened. Now, Helen went back to Scotland. She's probably wondering if, at least, she's probably saying to herself, well, at least things can't get any worse. But she spoke too soon because another woman comes into her life with a very, very sinister nature and a very, very sinister name to match, right? Her name was Essen Maule. Now, what sort of name is that? Essen Maule. E-S-S-O-N-M-A-U-L-E. I mean, who on earth is called Essen Maule? I mean, imagine that when she was a baby. What's your young daughter called, Mrs. Maule? Oh, we called her Essen. Essen. Oh, what a pretty name. Anyway, Essen Maule approached Helen in 1932 and said she was a writer and she wanted to write a book about Helen, and she was very friendly, very encouraging. And Helen thought, well, she wanted to regain her reputation. She wanted a clean break, so she agreed. But Essen Maule said, well, she wanted to observe a séance first, so Helen told her to meet her in Edinburgh, where she was appearing at a spiritualist church, and so Maule did. But it was a complete fiasco because it was a trap. Maule was not interested in writing a book about her at all. Maule was almost certainly working for Harry Price. And what happened was, at the pre-arranged moment, Maule and one of her accomplices, who was in the spiritualist church, while Helen had this ectoplasm out and flowing around, reached up and supposedly grabbed it. And they called the police. Helen was arrested. She ended up in court. Now the evidence, she was prosecuted under the Vagrancy Act and fined 10 shillings. Now the evidence, right, was what Maule said was that Helen Duncan was faking the ectoplasm by getting on a white cotton slip. She wore a white cotton slip under her black dress that she wore at the seances, and she'd taken this off and while the curtains were shut and used this as fake ectoplasm. The problem was, I mean, you just take a look at photos of Helen Duncan. She's a big, stocky woman. She weighed over 20 stone at her peak weight. This slip is probably a size 10. There's a photo of the slip on. If you Google Essen Maule, you'll see it. There's a photo online. It's a court exhibit. It's no more than a size 10. So it was probably 8 to 10 sizes too small for Helen. There's no way she could have put that on. She couldn't have hidden it anywhere on her body because she was searched. So basically the media had a go at her, but there were a few exceptions, like the spiritualist specialist press stuck up for her, because there's actually a magazine called Psychic News, which you can still read today. It's still going. I used to read it regularly, and the editor of that magazine actually pointed out some of the discrepancies that I just have. So it's odd that Helen lost the case, and why was that? I mean, maybe we can come back to that in a minute. But anyway, in 1941, Helen... But the war broke out, obviously, in 1939. UK declares war on Germany. World War II begins. And to begin with, it goes very badly. Of course, 60,000 people were killed in the Blitz. 300,000 were killed in the armed forces. It had a devastating effect on the country. And morale was very low, especially in the early years of the war. Morale was very low. But spiritualism burgeoned with all these people dying, and Helen, quite rightly, cashed in on this growing industry. She wanted to be a part of that, and why not? But what the result of this, unfortunately, was that she ended up in a imbroglio which made the Edinburgh trial pale into insignificance. Now, Helen used to conduct seances in various places, in spiritualist churches, and also in some people had private homes where they actually set up kind of makeshift spiritualist churches in their homes, and one of them was this one. It's a lovely little area. Now, this hasn't changed much, actually. There's some old photos of this area, but this is the 301 Jeweller's shop front. But it used to look like that osteopath there. The guy in there's just been explaining to me that, and there's some photos that prove that that's an original shop front from at least the 1940s, and so is that. Well, the signboard there's not, but this design here with the windows, these windows at the front, and then they go in the middle, and there's this little sort of porch in the middle, and there's a door. That is and these green stuff, these green bricks at the bottom. That's original. And there was a time when this was the same. This shop here, and it was a chemist shop. It was a chemist shop run by Mr. and Mrs. Homer. But Mr. and Mrs. Homer were also ardent spiritualists, and they converted this big room up here. We'll be taking a look at that later. This big room at the front of their house into what they called the Master Temple, and Helen was a regular visitor there. Whenever she was in Portsmouth, she would perform a séance there. Portsmouth, a lot of people died in this city. It was very badly blitzed. I think second only to London, or maybe even worse than London. But what would happen is, it was very, very standard, as you'll see when I take you up there. There was a curtained off partition in one end of the room and a row of seats. It was like a little theatre. And Helen would go into another room. She'd strip off her clothes. She'd undergo a thorough examination by a nurse who worked for her to verify she wasn't concealing anything in her body. Now, the nurse worked for her, yes, but female members of the audience would witness this. Helen allowed herself to be... It was quite undignified, really, and very embarrassing for her, but she was determined to show that she wasn't a fake. Then Helen would put on a plain black dress and nothing else, and she'd walk into the seance room and sit in a chair behind a curtain. The lights would be switched off, all the lights would be switched off, and the room would be illuminated only by a single red bulb, which was no more than 40 watts. In fact, sometimes Albert used to tell somebody to put a handkerchief or shade the bulb in some other way because it was still too bright. And then the séance would begin. The curtains would open, and Helen would then be in trance, and she would exude ectoplasm and various other effects like that. But then her life changed forever on the 27th of May 1941 when she performed a séance in that room up there. And Albert appeared, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry to have to tell you, but the British battleship has just been sunk." So he was Australian, Albert. He incarnated in human form and died in 1908. In 1909 he died, but he lived in Sydney, Australia. "I'm sorry to have to tell you that a British battleship has just been sunk. I have 1,400 spirits newly arrived who are among her officers and men." There was a gasp from the audience because no one had heard of any Royal Navy battleship being sunk, and such an occurrence would surely be in the news, but it hadn't. So surely this was wrong. But fatefully, one of the audience members was a man called Brigadier Roy Firebrace. Now, he was a famous astrologer and a spiritual researcher, but he was also an army intelligence officer. And after the séance, he went straight to his office and he made some inquiries with the Admiralty, and it turned out that, yes, a British ship had been lost. HMS Hood, which was an Admiral-class battle cruiser, and it had been in a big battle with 2 German warships, Bismarck, the famous one, and Prince Eugen, and it had been sunk, and 1,415 men had gone down with her. Now, Hood was the largest and most powerful ship the Royal Navy had, and her loss was a major blow to the war effort. And this came at a time, like I said, in the early years of the war, morale was low. Just a few months earlier, we'd had Dunkirk. The Blitz was at its height. People were getting blown up in their homes. Everyone was expecting Hitler to land at Dover any day now, and really the government decided to keep it a secret from people so as not to upset them. Now, Firebrace was, as I said, he was a keen spiritual researcher. He understood exactly what was going on. What it meant was that Helen Duncan was able to reveal state secrets that were otherwise classified by the testimony of the dead. And you can bet that really marked her card. Now, in November of that same year, Helen went on a tour of southern England again, and she came back here to the Master Temple, and Albert appeared again, and he wanted to introduce a new spirit, and the spirit came forward, and he said that he was a man who was a sailor on board the battleship HMS Barham, which is currently fighting in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. Now, this man told the audience he'd just been drowned. He'd been drowned as the ship sank, and again, the audience didn't know what to make of it because they'd heard nothing of the sort in the newspapers and the radio. But a woman in the second row up there, she recognised the apparition as her son, and she broke down with grief. And the news just spread all around Portsmouth. It's from end to end. You couldn't keep something like that secret anymore. And then the government again, they'd chosen not to publicise the loss of the Barham because, again, it was to keep morale up, not to let people know the awful truth. It was 850 men died on board that ship, but most of the crew, most of the families had not been informed yet for that reason, just to keep it secret. So I don't know what was being whispered in hushed meetings in the cabinet room, but I know that the truth is Firebrace was consulted and asked his opinion on what to do. That is provable. His daughters confirmed it. There's a document. Firebrace himself had exchanged letters with several people in cabinet. So there was no doubt about it that they took this very, very seriously indeed. And what happened next will, of course, depend on your opinions of spiritualism, whether you believe it or not, or whether you think Helen was just a fraud. But in a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. The fact is that people in government thought it was real. But what happened was everything changed, right? On the 19th of January 1944, Helen came to the Master Temple. She went in through the shop like she always do, and she went up, she stripped off, she was searched, she put on her black dress, and she went into the temple to begin the séance. But unknown to her, 2 individuals were in the audience. One was called Lieutenant Stanley Worth and the other PC Rupert Cross. One of them was an intelligence officer in the Provost Special Investigations branch, and the other was a policeman. And it was all organised. I mean, the police cars must have been hiding around the corner, maybe around this road here. And as soon as they must have been timed very carefully, or maybe there was a pre-arranged signal or something like that. But the police just ran. They must have driven round here, parked their cars, screeched to a halt, burst into the shop, straight up to the Master Temple, and arrested Helen. And what follows next is almost unbelievable, but we shall attempt to comprehend it. And here we are in the Master Temple. Well, it's not the Master Temple anymore, it's actually a lounge in the flat above the shop. As you can see here, it's just a pretty ordinary lounge, very elegant, well decorated lounge. Just to get people to get their bearings, in this corner here where the TV is, that was where Helen had her cubicle. There was a black curtain across here, and Helen would be inside sitting on the chair. Now here there were rows of seats, and there was over 40 people in this room. You could get quite a lot in, so you can imagine there was a lot of people. But this room was slightly bigger because this here is a partition, and we'll come out here and I'll just show you. This stairway wasn't there. The stairway actually came up through there, and there was this passageway that led down to the chemist shop, to the homer's shop, and people used to come in here, they'd pay downstairs, come up here and take a seat. This light would be switched off, and there'd just be a 40-watt red bulb on a shelf over here, which is no longer there. And Albert often used to say, you know, can you dim that light by putting a handkerchief over it or something? So there'd be rows of seats here. You can imagine people packed in quite close together. I imagine you can understand how Mrs. Potter, as I'll be telling you about Mrs. Potter later, but she was in the front row, so she'd have had her knees almost up to the cubicle. This bay here, this would have been covered by a blackout blind, this window, because it was wartime. But this is the original step on the bench. Now this is covered over. The present owner of the house has covered that over, but that is the original footsteps. So some of the spectators would actually sit on here, and they'd actually sit on this bench with their feet there, and they'd watch Helen from this side, with this blackouted window behind. The current residents of this property have told me that there are strange goings on in this area. Now, I'm not the first person to come to this building because of Helen Duncan. Helen's granddaughter has been over here. Mediums have been here as well. The lady who lives here has told me that she's seen a cat. That is interesting because animals did sometimes materialise in these physical mediumship sessions. She's seen several other things like heard footsteps and things like that, and some other strange things have happened here. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Master Temple. I'm very grateful to the lady who lives here for allowing me to come up here and have a look around. Much appreciated. So amazing to think, isn't it? It's changed a lot, but it's still the same. The fireplace is still there. Still the same room, and some of it is even still in the form it was in the 1940s.
No, you can't.
Mart, the Egyptian goddess there. Interesting. That's a laugh, isn't it? This, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Central Criminal Court of London. And it is here, in 1944, that Helen Duncan was tried under, and this is really, really strange because I have to go somewhere a bit quieter, it's a bit noisy here. Yeah, it's out there. Go down here, Green Arbour Court. It'll be a bit quieter down here. It's a bit bright. You get a better view of the building from here, actually. There's no real quiet time to film in London, unfortunately. Now Helen Duncan was. This is private. Oh, there we go. Let's just sit on these benches here. Now, Helen Duncan, like I said, stranger to these flirtations with the law, as you know. But she was, after the raid in Portsmouth, she was expecting just a week or two inside under the Vagrancy Act, maybe even a small fine she could have got away with. But her case was escalated and ended up here at the Central Criminal Court of London, where she stood trial under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. And this is a really archaic statute. It was hardly used actually for the last, for the previous 50 years almost, since the last case was actually heard in court. And they say it was a law over 200 years old. It was basically, the only reason it was on the statute books was because they couldn't get enough MPs together, they couldn't be bothered to get enough MPs together to repeal it. But the thing about it was, the Witchcraft Act carried a more severe sentence than the Vagrancy Act. You could get up to 3 months inside under the Vagrancy Act. Under the Witchcraft Act, you could get up to 9 months. And I think this is what it's all about. So basically, to recap, one of her seance at Portsmouth at 301 Cotton Road was busted. Lieutenant Stanley Worth and PC Rupert Crofts. She was halfway through the seance, and they leaped up and grabbed the fake ectoplasm, quote unquote. And of course it was an organised raid. The police were waiting outside, really at a signal from Worth. I don't know if he blew a whistle or something. They all burst in. And I've got a photo here of Helen Duncan. In this photo you can see that this is a newspaper photograph of Helen and her husband walking towards the Old Bailey. Hold on. Let me see it with the reflections. And you can see the confusion and disquiet on her face actually. What was going through her head? She must have been asking a lot of questions like, why had the charge been escalated the way it had? Why was she appearing in this? The Central Criminal Court of London, where you normally only got, in those days it was lords, traitors and serial killers. And of course, your opinion will depend on how literal you want to be, what your opinions are of the paranormal, and indeed how trustworthy the government is. Why was she denied bail? Things like that. I mean, on one level it was an open and shut case, because Helen Duncan was advertising herself as a medium, a psychic medium, able to contact the dead, when apparently all she was doing were tricks of hand, psychological mentalism, that kind of scam, the kind of thing that James Randi's into today. And well, in those days he was busy escaping from chains while hanging above Niagara Falls, but it's the kind of thing he later in his career he would deal with, supposedly. And I mean, on one hand you could say that the state had a cast iron case. There were multiple first-hand eyewitness testimonies of her chicanery in action. Also remember, she had a former conviction for the same offence 14 years earlier. And also when she was had a pre-sentencing hearing, Chief Constable Arthur West of Portsmouth Police gave her an absolutely damning character assessment. He said she was a pest on society, an exploiter of the vulnerable, a plunderer of grief-stricken people. So the judge had no choice but to impose the maximum sentence of 9 months. And at a superficial glance, you can tell she richly deserved it, didn't she? Is it really that simple? Now, to answer that question, we have to look at the background of the personnel involved in the trial. Now, in this courtroom here, in one of the courtrooms here, there's a number of courtrooms. I think there are 5 courtrooms in this building. The prosecuting counsel they chose was a guy called John Cyril Maud KC, and he was prosecutor. This is despite the fact that Maud was actually in this building conducting 2 cases at once. He was in court number 1 conducting a murder trial. He was defending a man on a charge of murder in court number 1. At the same time, he was dealing with Helen Duncan in court number 4. So you think it makes you wonder why the Crown didn't choose another barrister, just someone who could concentrate completely on putting Helen away. I mean, he had Moore did have an assistant, a guy called Henry Elam, E-L-A-M, I think that's how you pronounce it. But you'd think they'd get a guy to concentrate 100%, but I think there's a reason why the Crown chose Maud, John Cyril Maud KC, and that's because of his background and who he was and what he was doing. And the most interesting thing about him, he's very obviously had a very typical upper class background. He went to Eton College as a child. He went to Trinity College, Oxford. He was a member of one of these Inns of Court, these slippery, furtive organisations that are semi-Freemasonic, that all barristers have to join. He was in the Middle Temple, actually, one of the various, I think there were 4 temples. Now, a year after Helen Duncan was sent down, Maud was elected a Member of Parliament. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. But the most interesting thing was, he was also an intelligence officer. He was head of Section B19, which was a wartime unit responsible for human intelligence, sources of rumours, things like that, which was a part of MI5. John Maud KC was also an MI5 agent. But in his role in the head of Section B19, he was in a perfect position to be the kind of person who would investigate things like Helen Duncan, the source of rumours, you know, gossip and information people have picked up from other people, which is where Helen Duncan would fit in. Now, the choice of judge is interesting too, because the chief judge at the Central Criminal Court is called the Recorder of London. And he was Sir Gerald Dodson. And there is an authentic letter held by the Department of Public Prosecutions, which is today called the Crown Prosecution Service, which is specifically requesting that Dodson preside over the trial of Helen Duncan. Now, Sir Gerald Dodson is a former Royal Navy officer. He's also very active in charities and advocacy groups to do with the Royal Navy, and naval veterans, things like that. And so I think when it came to the 1941 incidents, the sinking of the Hood, the sinking of the Barham, he would have been deeply involved emotionally, I think, with that. Now, there's another man involved as well, and he was called Commander Ian Fleming, who was a very senior naval intelligence officer, and he kind of managed the whole incident. He has an interesting background, because he was a spy in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and he also monitored the very famous Moscow show trials in 1933. And I think actually the way that the Helen Duncan's trial was conducted indicates that that what happened in this building during the case of Helen Duncan, that was a kind of show trial. It has a structure that indicates the influence of Fleming and his experience of witnessing the Moscow show trials. Also, I mean, Fleming was also interested in the paranormal. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. He was also a close friend of Aleister Crowley. Yes, that famous purveyor of magic. And he was also close to Brigadier Firebrace, we've heard of before. And he would have had the same views as Firebrace. When Helen Duncan began her seance, reports from her seances started coming out, Fleming would immediately grasp the implications in the same way that Firebrace did. Now, does the name Ian Fleming sound familiar to you? Should do, because yeah, Ian Fleming, of course, is the author of the James Bond novels, which have, of course, spawned a very, very successful series of films. And this is the same Ian Fleming. And there's a lot of story behind that, actually, because 007, of course, was the code name for James Bond. 007 was sort of like connected with Dr. John Dee and people like that who are involved with the occult. It's very interesting. There are occult themes in the James Bond novels as well. Sex, magic, things like that. Sex and human sacrifice. Those are big themes in the James Bond novel, which shows that Fleming had a clear interest in the paranormal and occult. Now, Helen Duncan did have a defence counsel, of course. Even in this day and age, even in this situation, they can't stop her having a defence counsel. I mustn't give them ideas because I think they're working on that. But she chose a man called, well, he volunteered actually because he was very, very passionate about her case. Charles Lowsby, who was not a barrister. He was not a member of one of these Masonic Inns of Courts, but he was a solicitor, a very experienced solicitor. And he was also, as I said, he was a spiritualist. He was very passionate about what happened with Helen Duncan. Sadly, he made some major mistakes. He wanted to win the trial for her, but he didn't because maybe he was a bit naive. And I'll come to that in a minute. Now, the prosecution witnesses all reported that they'd been lured to the séance in Portsmouth by promises of seeing something supernatural. And instead they said they'd been confronted just with Helen Duncan covered in a white sheet pretending to be ectoplasm. That was their story. Now, that was what Worth said, that's what Cross said, that's what all the other prosecution witness said. There's only one problem. This white sheet was never found. Even though Rupert, Cross and Worth report having grabbed it when the police raid began. What? It was a police raid. Just think about it for a minute. This was a white sheet large enough to cover a 20-stone woman. So you're talking, it'd have to be at least a king-size bed sheet we're talking here. It was grabbed by a police officer and a naval intelligence officer during a police raid, and they never found it. They couldn't find it. And this is actually a recurring theme because a lot of people have lambasted Helen Duncan for using white sheets and cheesecloth and things, but very little of this said textile has ever been produced. I mean, the nearest anyone got to it was Essen Moore 14 years earlier with remember the extra small vest. And of course Harry Price with his little cut off bit of tissue paper and egg white. But again, I've already explained to you how that doesn't fit. So basically the whole case was a series of witness testimonies. That's what it was. The foundation was a series of eyewitness testimonies. There was no physical evidence at all. So it was basically fought over these. It was a battle of these testimonies, plus of course Helen's record, her criminal record. Now, Lieutenant Stanley Raymond Worth, RN, was, of course, the principal witness. He's still alive. The last thing I heard, he was still alive, and he was living in New Zealand, so he's nicely out of the way. He's living on the other side of the world. Only the most determined investigator could track him down. But what he said was, he was invited to Portsmouth by some friends to attend this spiritualist event which he called going to the spooks, and for him and his mates it was a form of entertainment. It was an alternative to going to the cinema or going down the pub. And he says that as soon as he saw Helen Duncan he could see that she was plainly a mountebank. He said that basically he could see that it was the curtains parted on the booth and all he could see was Helen Duncan prancing about, dressed with a white sheet covering her. He said he saw her face, and it was Helen Duncan's face. And he decided that he was going to make it his duty to bring her to justice. So he reported her to the police, and that's why the raid took place. And that's it. I mean, it's a bit strange though, because Lieutenant Worth himself was a special constable. He was the nephew of a senior police officer. His closest family friend was, guess who? Chief Constable Arthur West. And he knew the police officer in charge of the raid. So it was all set up basically, but the dodgiest factor of all is that he lied under oath. He was asked directly by Loseby whether he had any links to the intelligence services, and he replied, no sir. And he was simply spying on his own account, whatever the hell that means. But he was lying. Lieutenant Stanley Raymond Worth RN had been detached to the Naval Provost's Intelligence Division, which means he'd be the ideal person, because he was based in Portsmouth, for reporting to Maud and Fleming. So it's starting to look as if a little bit like all the personnel in the prosecution side of this trial are appearing to be kind of secret cabal. And there's more. One of Worth's friends made some money off this trial because a friend of his bet a subsequent friend of his, a friend of Worth's bet a friend of his, a third party in Oxford of all places, that Helen Duncan, he made a bet that Helen Duncan would be arrested in Portsmouth within 2 weeks, her trial would be held at the Central Criminal Court, and that the principal accuser's name would be Stanley Worth. And he won his bet. How did he know that? Either he was psychic himself, or he let it slip, either accidentally or deliberately. And could it be possible that Worth even had a cut in the bet? You never know. But it gets worse. I mean, these suspicious factors stack up more and more and more, because into Helen's life yet again comes Harry Price. Yes, Harry Price, who she had 12 years earlier. She had done an experiment in his laboratory, and he had denounced her as a fake. Was it 14 years early? Sorry, 1930, yeah. But the Department of Public Prosecutions asked Price to attend, not as a witness, but as a consultant to the prosecution. And he was asked to brief the prosecution witnesses. Now, this means that the prosecution witnesses were coached. Now, I'm not a lawyer, okay, but does that often happen in trials? Because this is all distinctly starting to look like an attempt to pervert the course of justice. Now, over the course of the trial, all the sitters who were at the séance at Portsmouth were put in the witness box, and their testimonies varies enormously depending on whether they were the prosecution or defence witnesses. All the Crown's witnesses report the same basic effects. The curtains opened, a human figure that looked like Helen Duncan moved around with a white sheet draped over the top of her, and the voices they heard were all like Helen Duncan's. And sometimes she revealed her face, and it was definitely Helen Duncan's face. So clearly Harry Price coached them well, that's all I can say. Though, as I said above, there was no white sheet was found by the police, even though Worth and Cross said they grabbed it, and the police were on the scene in a matter of moments. It's a bit strange, isn't it? Oops. Now, according to Worth and Cross, now Loseby did cross-examine them on this issue. Loseby did cross-examine Worth and Cross on this issue, and he said, well, if you said that you grabbed a white sheet, where is it? And they said, believe it or not, they said, well, obviously someone hid it in time, so we never managed to retrieve it. What? Let's just go through this again. It's the chaos of a police raid. It's a staged event. 2 police moles are in the audience, or among the sitters. The police burst in, the light goes on, they grab the fake ectoplasm, and someone manages to hide it just in time. A sheet big enough to cover a 20-stone woman. Well, you make your own conclusions from that, but I know what I think. But this is a very, very much a circular argument. Worth said, well, obviously someone hid it in time. Now this is if we did this, the skeptics would be onto us like a greyhound out the trap. Nobody found any sheet because somebody hid it. Why did you? So, how do you know somebody hid the sheet? Well, why else did we fail to find it? It's what's called a circular argument fallacy. And this is another, well, this is a big subject, but basically this is another part of how skeptics are full of double standards. Now, what Worth said was there was someone sitting in the audience with an arm sling, and there was. Do you know the sort of things where you've hurt your arm and your arm's like that, it's tied around your neck in a strap? Worth and Cross said that they said that this person must have hidden the sheet in their arm sling. But the first thing is, right, the police didn't search anybody, which is very, very odd indeed. You'd think Worth and Cross would insist on the room being searched and all the people who were there being searched, but they weren't. The second problem is that we're talking about, as I said, a big piece of linen, a huge, at least a king-size bed sheet you need, a very, very large piece of linen. And they're saying within the few seconds that this police raid took to take place, someone with one arm, only one working arm, managed to shove this enormous piece of textile into the arm sling. Assuming even a folded up sheet that big would even fit into an arm sling. Now, Lowsby's witnesses say something very different, because they received no coaching that I'm aware of, but Lowsby's witnesses say that Helen Duncan was sitting securely in the chair, as she always did during her seances, and a mysterious white semi-fluid substance issued from her mouth and nose, and this fluid morphed into the shapes of people, dead people, which some of the audience members recognised these people. Like there was Albert, of course, there was a case of the Barham sailor a few years earlier, and the Hood and things like that, and Mrs. Ann Potter saw her mother from just 2 feet away. She was on the front row. She was easily recognisable down to the moles on her skin. There was also a parrot, a cat, and several other animals materialised in the ectoplasm. And when the spirit withdrew from the ectoplasm, the witness reported that it sank into the floor and evaporated. Now, the prosecution tried to dismiss this. We're talking about the lighting. Now, whenever Helen held her seances, and this is the same for almost any physical medium, the lights were switched off. Now, that room in Copner Road, as you saw, it was a fairly sizable room, as you saw. It was lit by a single white bulb, and you see there was a big window bay there. Those windows during wartime would have been covered with blackouts, because this was the Blitz, remember? Now, when Helen was operating and she was performing her séance, that light was switched off and the bulb was removed for safety, because bright light can harm a medium in trance, and as you'll see later, that this actually caused Helen's demise in the end. When a medium in trance is a very, very vulnerable position. And the room was lit by a red lamp, which was only 40 watts, and sometimes Albert even requested that someone drape a handkerchief or something over the top of that. Now, according to Worth and Cross and the other prosecution witnesses, the light was so dim that they dismissed the people like Mrs. Potter, who say they recognised her mother and things like that, and all the other figures that were recognisable. And they said the light was so dim it could just have been Helen Duncan dressed up, putting on a fake voice. So they couldn't make that claim because the light was too bad, to be sure. But do you spot the contradiction? Do you? Yep, I do. It's amazing the court didn't. Worth and Cross were in the second row. Mrs. Potter was in the front row. And as you saw from that room, there was several with the rows of seats. This meant she would have been tight. Her knees would have been almost right up to the curtain in the booth. She saw her mother from only 2 feet away. Now, Cross and Worth were behind her, yet they say they recognise Helen Duncan in that same light. So basically, they're making a claim which they then go and criticise the defence witnesses for making. So that's a contradiction. Now, there were a lot of other contradictions. There were other things like the witnesses in their preliminary magistrate testimonies said something different to their Crown Court testimonies because they changed their story once Harry Price had got hold of them. Their police statements didn't match their testimonies in court. Now, Lowsby didn't do enough to challenge these discrepancies, and this was because of his strategy when it came to the trial. What he was doing, he was going to wait for the next phase of the trial, when he had a very, very ambitious idea, a very unusual idea. He would get this entire case dismissed in one fell swoop by proving that Helen Duncan was a real psychic medium. If Mrs. Duncan is a materialisation medium, then there is a spirit world near her at this moment, and a guide right here, possibly waiting for an opportunity to help us, help her. Let us call him. Yes, here, in the Central Criminal Court of London. Why not? She requires a curtained off partition, a red light, and nothing more. Now this is what Loseby said to the court. Those are his exact words. But the judge refused point blank. The defence counsel appealed, and then Dodson agreed to let the jury decide. So he didn't say he could do it, but he polled the jury, and they elected not to. And I wonder how close that poll was. I mean, if you were on that jury, would you have voted no? I mean, who on earth on that jury wouldn't want to see something like that, if only for their own personal curiosity? There's no way I'd have voted no. I'd have voted yes without hesitation. I mean, Helen used to charge about 10 shillings for every sitting. Now here, you get a chance to watch it for free in a court as well, where there's, you know, which is more convincing. Now Dodson's refused. I mean, in a way, it's legally understandable if you understand law, as I partly do, and can't say I'm an expert, but there is. The thing is, the thing about it is that the truth of the matter is, it was not the reality of spiritualism that was on trial. All right. This is the important point. Whether the true manifestation of spirits was possible or not was not the issue. If it was possible, or even if it were possible whether Helen Duncan was capable of doing it, what counts is, did she do it that evening in Portsmouth? At that house above the chemist shop in Portsmouth. That was the only issue the court was concerned with. You know, Helen could have been the greatest medium in the world, popping out ectoplasmic entities left, right and centre at will. But if she cheated just once in Portsmouth, then the trial was valid. And I think this was Loseby's mistake. But there's another issue to this. Now, on another level, I mean, if Helen had been allowed to perform in the court, then it would devastate the prosecution's case nonetheless, because the prosecution would then have to prove that a medium who was capable of genuine spirit manifestation and psychic phenomena would need to cheat. It would make their assertion far less plausible. And it would show Helen to be a very different kind of woman indeed. Because Dodson, Maud and the rest, like if Dodson and Maud and Fleming and Worth and all the others were in league with each other, okay, to put Helen away, then they would have to, they'd go to no length. I mean, even rigging jury polls. I don't discount this jury poll was rigged, but the thing is, they were portraying her as a ruthless harridan, an utter fraud and con woman, a charlatan who'd made her a livelihood out of this double dealing, this artifice, this miasma. And a successful demonstration in court would show her to be a very, very different kind of character. Oh, well, on Friday the 31st of March 1944, over 70 years ago this year, the judge summed up and the jury retired to consider their verdict. And that took less than 30 minutes. Guilty. And the following Monday, Chief Constable Arthur West gave her this damning character assessment. So she could only expect the maximum 9 months in Holloway prison. And as poor Helen was taken down, she cried out in her broad Scottish accent, "I hadn't even done anything. Oh God, is there a God?" In June, she appealed against her sentence unsuccessfully, and eventually she was released on Friday the 22nd of September, which is when her sentence was complete. Mr. and Mrs. Homer, who ran the Master Temple in Portsmouth above the chemist shop, they were convicted as accessories and they were given a 4-month suspended sentence. Now on June the 6th, while Helen was languishing in her prison cell, Operation Overlord took place, a mass amphibious invasion of Normandy, France by British and Allied forces. History would come to know it as D-Day. Now there's a strong connection between the supernatural and warfare. It's a lot stronger than you might think. Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great used to consult soothsayers before going into battle. And of course there's the famous case of Jeanne Roumet, a little teenage peasant girl from France. In 1429, the King of France put her in charge of the army because he believed she was receiving divine guidance from God. And of course, Joan of Arc, as she became known, did an awfully good job at the Siege of Orleans, where of course France beat England. And in the Cold War, there's a lot of research into remote viewing and things like that in the Cold War. Uri Geller was involved in that. And of course that's still going on in the modern age. If you watch the film The Men Who Stare at Goats, you'll see a bit about it. Although I actually recommend the book by John Ronson. That is far more interesting. So paranormal powers and government machinations go hand in hand. Despite ridicule of the notion, despite the skeptics saying these things don't exist, governments and for military purposes have used paranormal phenomena very much, an awful lot. So we're told that Helen Duncan's case was simple and straightforward. She was cheating. She was caught cheating. She had a fair trial, and the outcome was she was fairly convicted for her crimes and punished. But I'm going to offer you an alternative hypothesis. All right. I'm going to offer you I'm going to put it to you, to use court language, I'm going to put it to you that Helen Duncan was a real physical medium. And the reason she was imprisoned was because her powers allowed her to gain access to classified information, inadvertently, about the war effort from those who had died, who've been briefed into the secret and then subsequently passed away, whether it's a sailor on board a ship or something else. It would only take one Nazi spy to attend her seances for this information to be immediately leaked. Now, by 1944, preparations were very much underway for D-Day. This, of course, was a battle that was absolutely crucial to the outcome of the war. This involved a lot of training, a lot of logistics, a lot of planning. There was even a fake village built in Dorset. You can visit it today. It's a museum piece. This operation consisted of thousands of people, all of them sworn to secrecy. Now, to use my own terminology, this is what you might call a dangerously top-heavy conspiracy. And I think the people knew it. I think the people involved knew that it was very precarious what they were planning. And Helen Duncan was an unpluggable leak. It would only take one of the people involved in D-Day to die before June the 6th. Only one enemy spy to be in the seance room if that person appeared in spirit, and the secrecy of D-Day would be blown. So the government concocted a plan to put Helen somewhere where she could not practice her mediumship for the duration of the run-up to D-Day. They used intelligence agents in the police and legal system to frame Helen, imprison her, and that's why it happened. I'm quite relieved actually, because in a way, what would have happened if they hadn't succeeded in putting Helen in jail? They'd probably have killed her. Now, someone at the West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church I was talking to said all they had to do was ask her. She was a very patriotic woman. All they had to do was ask her not to perform any seances before, for a while, And she would have done it. They'd probably had to pay her off, but it'd be a small price, much less than her trial cost. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't think governments do sort of trust in asking. You know, I think that's unlikely. Now, some of the skeptics will say, well, that's just the way things are, because Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, and he was Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, and Winston Churchill was a spiritualist believer himself. So there was some kind of climate of woo hanging over government, and this was why it went ahead. But that's not true. All right, this is a skeptic excuse which they made up out of ignorance, because Winston Churchill knew nothing about the plan. Because on the 3rd of April, he sent a memo to the Home Secretary saying this: "Let me have a report why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost of this trial to the state, observing that witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery to the detriment of necessary work in the courts." So Churchill knew nothing about it. That memo comprehensively disproves that. I don't know what the answers are. I mean, Stanley Worth is really, I think he's the only person left alive who might know the truth. But last thing I heard, he was still alive, but he'd be very old now. He'd be at least in his 80s if he's still alive, and he's in New Zealand. I can't go all the way there. But he was last interviewed a few years ago, and he doggedly maintains his story. He said that he ended up at Helen's seance by chance. His mates invited him to the spooks for a laugh. And he reported it to the police out of a feeling of personal indignation. And he feels she got her just desserts. Is he being honest, or is he still just doing his duty under the Official Secrets Act? Perhaps after 70 years of telling the same falsehood, he's come to believe it himself. Now, there's an interesting story, which is there's a book. There's a science fiction author in Oxford called Brian Aldiss, and he's written a book called Heliconia Winter, which is the last of a trilogy. And in this book, it's very interesting because these creatures on this planet, they have something called PAUK, P-A-U-K, which is natural mediumship abilities. And they go into a state called PAUK, which is they go into a trance and they can speak to their dead relatives. And everyone has it on this planet. And the government on that planet decided to outlaw PAUK. They decided to outlaw it because they're worried that the dead will reveal state secrets. And I think this is what they basically did to Helen. What can you do when you can't silence someone even by killing them? After she came out of prison, Helen Duncan went back to spiritualism. She was released from jail. She had a few more brushes with the law, as she always had done, but none of them were nearly as serious as her trial in 1944. She was the last person ever to be tried under the Witchcraft Act, and it was soon replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951, which was similar to it's a kind of watered down Witchcraft Act, really. It made life very difficult for spiritualists in some cases until it was repealed, but it was not repealed until 2008. And since then, happily, there's been no equivalence, despite the fact that some skeptics who rant on about free speech for atheists and skeptics are very, very keen to support authoritarian laws for people who don't agree with them. But there has been no replacement for the Fraudulent Mediums Act. But in all that time, I mean, even when the Fraudulent Mediums Act was in force, the government never ever came down as hard on anyone as they did on Helen Duncan, before or since. So, there's an awful lot to think about here, isn't there? And I think here at the Central Criminal Court in London, known as the Old Bailey, or the Old Bailey is actually just the street, not the actual place, but it's called the Old Bailey. This building here was the scene of what I think is one of the most significant legal dramas in history, one which includes the paranormal, and government cover-ups. In other words, making it the perfect combination for HPANWO. This is a display at West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church, and there are some articles here about Helen Duncan. That's an article from 1997, the Hex Files. That's on the centenary of Helen's birth. This is an original Psychic News from February the 2nd, 1957, which is the one after Helen died. As you can see here, this is covering the raid on Helen Duncan's house, which was here in West Bridgeford, Nottinghamshire. You can pause and read, feel free to pause and read.
If Andy comes, you see, he can go upstairs as well, can't he? On Jim's table, and those four can swap over.
I'm coming to help. Bertrand Russell, of course, is an article about Bertrand Russell as well, because he was a big sceptic and an MBA. So I'll capture that bit about Bertrand Russell as well. Have you got too many people? Feel free to pause and read.
Many people as such. Because, no. There'll be me and John, and
okay.
Dennis is not coming, is he? And Chrissy will.
It's a fascinating document that kept in framed for everyone to see. Well, hello again. I'm at Ella Road in West Bridgeford, Nottingham, and believe it or not, the building behind me, this house behind me here, was once the location of West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church, which you saw in, which I showed you earlier on, which has now moved to a different premises. But believe it or not, on the 28th of October, on the 28th of October 1956, Helen Duncan performed her last séance within these walls. One of the rooms in this house was dedicated to spiritualism, and it was a spiritualist church, and it was run by Mr. Timmins, who was a chiropodist, I believe. I called him Dr. Timmins, but apparently he was just a Mr. Chiropodists are not honoured with the title of doctor, unfortunately. But anyway, what happened was, it was very, very similar to the Portsmouth scene. This establishment was raided by the police. Imagine the police cars cruised up this lovely suburban road here from whichever direction, I'm not sure, and they parked outside, and then they burst in and grabbed Helen and arrested her. And now, as you'll know, if you speak to anyone who's familiar with physical mediumship, it's extremely dangerous to the medium to actually interfere with them in any way. Even switching a light on can have serious, can do them serious harm when they're in trance. And Helen Duncan was injured badly.
Something about Helen Duncan, are you?
Oh, hello. You've heard of her?
Well, I live in the house that she used to visit. Yeah.
Really? That's interesting. Well, I'm making a film about her.
Why don't you just leave it alone? Love, it's been thrashed to death.
I'm afraid I'm entitled to film on a public street.
Yeah, you are.
And,
But we'd rather you didn't take photographs of the house if you don't mind.
well, thank you, madam. I appreciate your request, but unfortunately, you know, I'm actually entitled to film on a public highway if I wish.
Yeah, that's right. We'll point your camera the other way.
No, I mean, I can point my camera anywhere I like. Good day. And yeah, the establishment was raided. Helen was badly injured, and it's because the ectoplasm, because she had the ectoplasm out of her body. Now, in now, she'd never enjoyed good health all her life. She suffered second-degree burns in this case. She was rushed to the hospital. They treated her at the hospital, and she was sent home to Edinburgh to recover. And she died. She died on the 6th of December the following year, and this is just a few weeks later. And now, of course, she's always been a very sickly woman, as I'd explained, and never in the best of health. But this aggravated her condition. I mean, it's hard to know what would have happened if she had not been attacked in that way. How much longer she would have lived? It's hard to know. So I suspect that the attack actually indirectly to her death. And so she passed away. But as I explained, she has her supporters. There's a campaign to gain her a posthumous pardon. And well, her supporters within the spiritualist movement say she's been in regular contact ever since. Now, it could be there's a deeper issue involved here, all right, to this strange case of Helen Duncan. This might be something to do with why Recorder Dodson blocked the demonstration that Loseby wanted to perform in the Old Bailey in 1944. It could also explain why Essen Moore got her nailed in 1932. There could be a far more long-term strategic goal involved here other than D-Day. And that comes back to the fact that maybe the acceptance of the truth of spiritualism could have profound implications for society as we know it. That's something to think about, isn't it? See, there are organisations like the RAND Corporation and the Tavistock Institute. And what these organisations, one of the roles these organisations play, one of the things they do, is they assess every single scientific discovery and invention, and they judge it on what its effects would have on society. Every time a new product comes on the market, every time some scientist is about to announce some new breakthrough, the Tavistock Institute, the RAND Corporation, and lots of other organisations like that will check it over. They'll just check it over and get together, have a little meeting with us, sit around and think, well, how will this impact society? How will that impact society? What changes will it bring about? That's the question. Change. What changes will it bring about? And I think that this comes down to the acceptance of life after death. Now, I know very well a lot of people believe in life after death anyway. I myself do. A lot of people accept it as real. In fact, a large proportion of people accept it as real. But there's a great deal of difference between acceptance on a personal level and official acknowledgement. That is, that government officials, scientists, in education, the media, an official acknowledgement of this would be very, very different indeed. Very different. It all comes down to that Freudian father figure thing. Father figure. The Freudian father figure. The thing is, I mean, I think there are people in government, in science, in education, and the media who know very well that the afterlife exists. They just don't want us to know. Like so much else in this world. And they've kept it secret for much more fundamental reasons than simply concealing military attacks, D-Day, things like that. Because I think our view of death at the moment, the official story of death, shall we call it, is very, very different to people's often. I mean, basically it's binary, and it's twofold, and it is completely. There's only two choices basically. You buy into an off-the-shelf package religion like Islam or Christianity, which says things like God decides everything. When you die, your soul belongs to him. It will return to him, and he will decide what to do with it. Have you put enough money in the church collection plate? In which case, he'll let you into heaven, where you spend the rest of eternity. Or if you haven't, you only put in your loose change, then you go to hell, hellfire and damnation forever and ever and ever. The other side of the coin is, of course, endorsed by people like Richard Dawkins and Andrew Copson, MBA, which is that there's no afterlife at all of any kind. Our consciousness, our mind, is a product of our brains, and when we die, that consciousness vanishes forever. That's the British Humanist Association. Like that's the other alternative. So it really is such an either-or situation. This, you can either choose one or you can choose the other, but you can't choose both. Just cross over. This is where I am here. Ella Road. Beautiful little location, actually. Of course, as you saw back then, there's an awful lot. I mean, there still has a kind of power of taboo. I mean, you notice the way the lady reacted, the lady who lives in the house now, how she reacted when I was filming. So you're not tossed into the hands of some vengeful, merciless god. You are not. You don't vanish forever into a haze of nothingness. And that's so it's either one or the other. That's the official line, is it's either one or the other. I don't think it's either, and I think that's the key point here. Now, if you ask Andrew Copson and Richard Dawkins, and they've actually commented on this, they say that if this acknowledgement, you know, it would actually reduce the value of life, the life we're having now, if there was an afterlife. Now, I've never quite understood why that is. But I mean, it's important to see, not to see it from our point of view, or even the point of view of the atheo-skeptics like Dawkins and Copson, but to see it from the point of view of those in power, the powers that be, or the powers that were, or the powers that shouldn't be, whatever you choose to call them. I think that the acknowledgement that life after death exists would actually have a very, very positive effect on human morale. Unless, of course, your self-esteem is tied up with being an MBA, MBA. It would eliminate the fear of dying, I think. Well, maybe it would eliminate or significantly reduce it to an enormous level. I mean, probably, I wouldn't say nobody, very, very few people would fear dying. When at the moment lots of people do for various reasons. Either you're scared of your own oblivion, but at the same time you're told your oblivion is unavoidable, or you're scared of God. But whatever it is, death is inextricably tied up with fear. In indigenous society it was very different, hopefully, because indigenous societies are a good example of a society that does accept the reality of life after death from the spiritualist model. It would make grieving over the death of a loved one far, far easier, because when that loved one died, it would constitute a temporary separation, not a permanent loss. It would just be a transient state of affairs, which would inevitably end, eventually, in a happy reunion. So people would find grief a lot easier to deal with. And I mean, I don't know, I don't have all the answers to this, and maybe I need to write a dedicated article and make a dedicated film about it, but there's no doubt that the Illuminati guard the reality of spiritual truth more than anything. It's bigger than UFOs, it's bigger than Atlantis, it's bigger than free energy, it's bigger than 9/11. Even bigger than the reptilians. And this entails that the successful suppression of spiritual reality must be quintessential to the maintenance of the New World Order. It's bigger than any of those other little snippets of hidden knowledge I've just listed. I'm still not 100% sure why, as I explained. I mean, I know why the church wouldn't like it. It's very obvious, because they'd no longer be able to threaten people through hellfire and damnation. The priest would no longer hold the keys to the afterlife. But on a secular level, it's more complicated. And as I was explaining, it's got a lot to do with these organisations like Tavistock Rand, and how and our government's relationship with us, and how they see us, and how they fear us, basically. They fear what would happen in the event of some revelation of this type. So it's a pretty complicated situation, and what's more, I suspect that the cover-up is a long way from ending. In fact, I think this is probably one of the last secrets to go. In fact, a few days ago, I attempted to revise Helen Duncan's Wikipedia page, which is extremely biased and extremely misleading. I did it according to the rules of Wikipedia. I read the instructions carefully. I did it according to the rules. I put in source links, references, everything. And within a few hours, somebody, don't know who, had edited it back, even though I'd revised it correctly. I think one day, I mean, we will know the truth one day. Even this secret will fall eventually, when the New World Order's over and the post-Illuminati world begins. And who knows, then, in legal cases, in things like that, it could be quite normal practice to subpoena a ghost. just like Loseby wanted to do in the Central Criminal Court. And we might be able to put Albert on the stand. That could become commonplace in law. Or am I completely wrong? Am I completely deluded, ladies and gentlemen? That's nice flowers behind us there. Maybe I'm just mistaken about everything, and everything I've told you in this film has a rational, quote-unquote, explanation. Maybe all Helen Duncan was doing was using cheesecloth. Maybe she's not a real medium at all. She's a fake, she's a fraud, she was regurgitating cheesecloth. But as I was explained, in that condition, then it would have to be some kind of mystical levitating super cheesecloth. Or is that cheesecloth all the way down? Thanks very much for watching HPANWO TV. Hospital Port as pride and dignity stop the New World Order.